You've just been invited to be a guest on a podcast, or maybe been on 10 podcasts, and you're looking to get and be a little bit better of a guest, or maybe it's your very first time that you're going on the show, and everywhere in between. These are the top 5 best podcast guest practices that I recommend everyone should follow when they're being a guest on a podcast. The first piece would be knowing the audience. Who are you speaking to? For me, I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs, and then I also speak to a lot of real estate investors. When I'm talking to the real estate investor crowd, I'm usually talking about 2 different topics. I'm either talking about how I became a passive investor and how I've been investing in real estate. Outside of that, I'm talking about how our podcast booking agency works with real estate investors to build brand awareness, to have networking opportunities, to hopefully drive conversions and leads where you could eventually find more investors, whether they're accredited or non-accredited. So I can go down those 2 routes when it comes to the real estate audience. When it comes to the entrepreneurial audience, I'm not going to talk about accredited investors. I'm going to talk more how I built the business, the systems and processes, how I got started, how I built the team, how I've grown the revenue, what it's been like managing the team. So you want to know your audience depending on who you're going to be speaking to, because I'm going to share different stories, whether I'm speaking to an entrepreneurial audience or whether I'm speaking to more of a real estate audience. Before I go into the podcast interview, I just want to prep mentally, and this goes back to knowing the audience. I'm going to check out their podcast. I want to see how long it is. Is it 20 minutes? Is it 30 minutes? Do I have an hour to speak on the show? If I have an hour, I'm typically going to talk a little bit longer on the podcast itself. And I want to prep and say, okay, what value can this audience get out of me today? Oh, it's a passive investing podcast. I'm going to dive into passive investing and share my experiences. Oh, it's a podcast for people that want to raise capital. I'm going to share my experiences on how we've helped our clients. Oh, it's an entrepreneurial podcast. I'm going to dive into how I've built and grown my business. And I just want to prep in advance and figure out what's the value that I'm going to be sharing on this podcast, because you do not want to make it an infomercial. There's always going to be a point in time in every interview where the podcast host is going to say, hey, where can our audience learn more about you? That's where you can go and say, hey, this is our website. If you want to get access to our ebook, if you want to book a consult with our team, go to our website.com. So you're going to have that opportunity, but between the beginning of the interview up until the almost the end of it, where you're going to be promoting yourself, that's where you want to provide value. That's where you want to help out the audience, because I found that the reason people come to our company when I'm going on podcast interviews is because I'm providing value. I'm teaching you everything that you need to know to be a good podcast guest, to be a host, to start your own show, to be a guest and find shows for you to be on yourself. Because I know at the end of the day, anyone can go out there and start a podcast, and you can edit it yourself. You can go out there, you can be a guest yourself, and you can go out and find shows yourself. It's whether or not you want to spend the time and whether or not you want to find the right shows, which is what our team, and that's part of the value that we bring as a company. But this isn't to say that you can't go out and do it yourself. So I just want to provide as much value. So someone comes to me and says, oh, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Instead of me doing it myself, I'm going to go work with his company. And again, that just comes from me providing value. Once the interview has gone live, I want to make sure that I'm promoting the episode. A lot of the times, the podcast host, they'll give you social media snippets, and they have to pay for those snippets, or either they're paying someone or they're paying with their time that they're taking to create those social media snippets. So what you want to do with those is you just want to make sure you share them out there on your social media, and just make sure that they're out there for you, so that way you can promote that episode and the host knows that, hey, you did a good job. Thank you so much for coming on. I know that the time I put into creating these social media posts was well worth it. And just backtracking a little bit, part of the process is you just want to make sure that you're being authentic. And what I mean by that is, don't be someone that you're not. Don't rephrase or picture everything in your head and all the different speeches that you're going to give in your podcast interview. You just want to be authentic. If you're laid back, just lead laid back. No matter what your personality style maybe just be authentic to who you are. Don't be someone who you're not. If you're all of a sudden start bragging about yourself and your accomplishments, and that's not something that you necessarily do, then it's going to come across as inauthentic. And I can guarantee you that every podcast host and audience is going to realize that it's inauthentic, and they can just hear it coming across the microphone. And then the last piece of advice that I recommend doing is sending off a thank you card to the podcast hosts themselves. Again, they took time to prep for you, having you on the podcast, had you on the podcast, did all this work having the interview go live. It's a big lift, whether time or money, to produce the episode and go live. So you just want to send a thank you note to the podcast host. I use a service, and I'm slipping on the name right now, but basically it sends out the thank you cards on my behalf, and then has like a robot write it, makes it look really nice and professional, as if I was writing it myself, so that way I don't have to go out and buy these thank you cards all the time. It just makes it easy. I customize it with my logo, with my text that I want, and just again make it look nice and professional. So that way, okay, this interview has gone live, I'm going to go place this order, then they're going to get the thank you card within the next 2 to 5 days. Again, for me, I wouldn't want to sit down and handwrite it. That's not something that I prefer to do, but there are softwares out there. I believe it's coming to me. It's called like handwritten.io, maybe, I think, is the one that we use as a company. And that's what we do for honestly all of our guests or all of our clients that we have. Anytime they're on a podcast interview, we send a thank you card to the podcast host, just saying like, hey, like, thank you so much for having our client on the show, yada, 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 because we know like without the podcast hosts themselves, our company wouldn't be in business, because there'd be no podcast for our clients to go on. So we want to thank them for the contribution to the podcasting space. So that's really the top 5 practices that you should know when you're going out there and being a podcast guest.